Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our panel. My name is Julie J. I'm the co-founder of the Yukon Prize for Visual Arts. I'm also a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Gallery of Canada. And our panel today is called the National Gallery and Beyond. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. So I'll start with Michelle Lavallee, who is here on my left. Michelle is a mother, artist, and curator, and currently holds the inaugural position of Director of Indigenous Ways and Curatorial Initiatives. Is that what it is?
Oh, yeah.
That's what it's called?
Well, it's a super long title.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I thought it, okay. So anyways, it's a new position, which is about Indigenous ways at the National Gallery of Canada. And prior to that, she was the director of the Indigenous Arts Centre at CERNAC, which is the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. And she was also curator at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina for 10 years. Michelle's curatorial practice often explores the colonial relations that have shaped historical and contemporary culture, and through numerous exhibitions. And the most recent one, at least that I have seen, is Radical Stitch, which I believe is coming to the National Gallery, and which has been at numerous galleries and been really popular all over. And Michelle is Anishinaabe. She's a member of the Chippewas of Nawash, unceded First Nation in Cape Croker, Ontario. So Jeneen, Frei, Njootli, on my right, is Vuntut Gwitchin, interdisciplinary artist. She's the co-creator of the Rematriate Collective. They are a member of the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation, and they recently moved home to Old Crow, which is a remote fly-in community in the Yukon, the only fly-in community in the Yukon. They have a BFA from Emily Carr University and an MFA from UBC. And Jeneen was one of the 2018 Sobey Art Awards finalists and has worked in a wide variety of media, including as a performance artist, a fashion designer, filmmaker, work with textiles, and many other media. And they are the mother of a delightful 1.5-year-old Nico.
Yeah.
So welcome to the Yukon, and because I think for Michelle, this is your first time here, so we're hoping to show you all of the wonderful things that attract artists to create beautiful work up here. I'm going to start with a few questions to get the discussion going, and then I hope to leave time for audience questions. So Michelle, you were recently created to the new Department of Indigenous Ways at the National Gallery. So can you tell me a bit about the role of the National Gallery in the sort of larger arts infrastructure in Canada, and then also about what this new department is hoping to achieve?
I can try, yeah. So, Ani Bojo, Gwitchin, Indigenous, Michelle Lavallee. So, yeah, I have a very long title. Director of Indigenous Ways and Decolonization and Director of Indigenous Curatorial Initiatives at the National Gallery of Canada. Thank you for inviting me, and it's really great to see you, and thank you for sharing that song. And although I can't sing to save my life, I like hearing language and songs. It does help ground me as well. And thank you all for taking time to come listen to us. Hopefully there's something interesting we can say. Oh, sorry. I'll talk louder. Thank you for the reminder. And yeah, I think it's always good to also acknowledge we're on unceded territories of many nations here in particular, but also the numerous communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that make home here and try and move things forward in a good way. And yeah, it is my first time here, and it's amazing, and I'm sorry it's my first time here, and I'm sorry there isn't more people from mainstream institutions that don't come up here, because that is a problem. That is what leads to underrepresentation. And your question about the National Gallery and its role, the National Gallery is extremely problematic. It's held attention. It's always claimed a center space for too long, but excluding a lot of voices at that time. So I think part of the reason for the new department that was developed, one, it's a very significant commitment on behalf of the gallery to bring in 2 Indigenous people on senior management level. That doesn't exist anywhere else. And part of our role is to help move the gallery forward. And it's not about taking anything away or removing anything, but contextualizing it a little bit better, making sure we're including all those voices, diversifying in making the space more welcoming to all communities. And of course, my area, I'm a contemporary curator, but I've spent a career advocating for Indigenous voices in institutions and helping, whether it be directly or indirectly, building collections across Canada to make sure Indigenous artists were being exhibited and shown. And also looking back at the history of those before me who, I have the privilege of being in the positions I've held because of all the work that certain artists and curators did, in the 60s, 70s. So it's like always kind of acknowledging that trajectory, and then how to impact things like at a major institution. I started in artist-run centers, community spaces, moved on to institutions, and now the mothership of institutions, two of them. Like I was a Fed for a little while. I guess I sort of still am, but don't hold that against me. But yeah, it's really critical to be addressing policies. It's one thing to bring in Indigenous people or people from a variety of communities into spaces, but if you're not changing the base, the structure and how it was built and informed by Western patriarchal colonial agendas, you can't sustain that change, right? And people burn out. The burnout rate for lots of people is high, but particularly for Indigenous peoples, we're usually only one in an institution, and then you have to answer for everybody, which is impossible. And then the expectation is you're there to educate everybody else, but it's actually the opposite. I'm not here to help you understand your place in this history or to explain what Indigenous philosophies and ideas are. It's like that onus is on you. I can help encourage you. I can help share certain things with you, but it's not my job to educate everybody else. That it used to be our job. I think that's why there was a lot of onus put on us, but now it's like no. do the work. Google us.
Ask Auntie Google.
Yeah, so I don't know if that answered the question, but yeah, Gwitchin, and excited to hear you talk.
Okay.
Talk too much already.
No. Well, we really enjoyed your singing. Thank you so much, Jeneen. I wanted to ask you about your recent move to Old Crow from Vancouver. So it is a fairly remote community, and you also became a counselor for the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation. So that's a big change going into politics. So what prompted the move, and how has living in Old Crow affected your perspective and your art?
Oh. Vangwinzi Shori Jeneen Frei Njootli Vaji. I'm grateful to be here today and to be sitting here with everyone. And we did have some fun when the cameras weren't rolling. So in terms of moving home to Old Crow, I'm no longer on Chief and Council, but I'm really grateful that I got to do some of that service work for my community, and I did 6 months, and I waited till there were 2 more counselors that came on, and then I stepped back. But I'm so glad that I did it, and I used to be a professor at the University of British Columbia, and I lived for 14 years on and off in Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, and I. Just in terms of engaging with politics, I think a lot of Indigenous people don't really have a choice on whether or not to be politically engaged. And so much of us are fighting for our livelihoods, our survivance, for our nations, for our lands, for our waters, and for our babies. And I also want to bring up Jaleh Mansour talks about when politics became the politics of aesthetics, and also how politics are becoming increasingly aestheticized. And those things are not uncomplicated. And in terms of how moving home has impacted my practice, home has impacted and shaped my practice immensely. And as I said earlier, I'm really grateful to have had a relationship with my home community since I was a baby. I wasn't raised there, but I have memories of like being in a dog sled, of dog running, of hunting, and being stitched into clothes since I was a baby. And I think I'm really looking forward to like pulling into my body how that work of, but also like pulling certain things out of my body, because I think learning about how to write policy is really empowering and also really challenging, and just seeing how much space there is. And I'm so proud of being Vuntut Gwitchin. I'm so proud of our community and of our ancestors who fought so hard for settling our incredible land claims. But it's still, through doing that work, I see how much it's not nation to nation, and the language is to draw down from the crown. And if that's the language that we're using, through that experience, I saw how much space there is between sovereignty and self-governance. And I also want to bring up Dylan Robinson's work, where he talks about sovereignty of sight does not equal sovereignty. What is it? It's sovereignty of sound does not equal the sovereignty of listening.
Yeah.
Right. And so just thinking about that, and he has an image in his work before his book came out on hungry listening. And I'm sorry, Dylan, for this incredible Stolo person, community member and writer, but just that unequal sign, right? And just thinking about that, like the self-governance is not equal to sovereignty, and wondering about all the work that our ancestors have done to shift that, and then how much work we have to do now to continue to shift that, because the fight is still changing. It's on shifting ground. And making work on the shifting ground. Natalie, who had that store hunter gather. Anyway, she writes about scree and the idea of like working or trying to write on scree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about decolonization. Because, Michelle, one of your titles, I believe, is Director of Indigenous Ways and Decolonization at the National Gallery. So I know that that's kind of an ongoing project. It's not something that you have kind of the answer to, but I'm just wanted to find out sort of what decolonization means to you in the context of an institution, and just maybe some examples of decolonization.
Yeah, and I mean that's a tough one. It's a big, scary word for a lot of people. I'm not quite sure what it is, because it doesn't exist. It has never existed. There's no template. So it's one thing to call, use these words. We think we understand what we're supposed to be doing, but for me, it's really about how how do you work within an institution that is deeply colonial and create spaces of sovereignty, right? Because that's really what it's about. It's like being part of and having that decision-making authority. Have Indigenous people speaking for Indigenous rights, and not having to run that through and be vetoed by somebody who's not an expert on that. So trying to find ways to work together. A lot of collaborative work, between departments, between curators, between nations. Rebuilding trust is a big one. Trust is a huge one, because, trust, it comes in drops but gets lost in buckets. Somebody was telling me that the other day. And so I think there's lots of buckets that we need to kind of air out. And having people, Indigenous people and other peoples of diverse backgrounds in institutions is critical, but in positions of decision making. That's what will help decolonize or indigenize, or whatever word you want to put on that. But that's a big part, making sure there's space voices and space for dissent as well, and space for failure. Not That's different than setting us up for failure, because that's often what happens. But allowing that space to have those difficult conversations, and we all know here, like, art is the perfect way to enter those types of dialogues. It's really difficult sometimes to speak about certain histories and issues and concerns, face to face, especially if you're not familiar with somebody or their culture. But you can stand in front of an artwork and talk about the artwork, and it just makes it easier. It kind of helps bring you in, and provide that space to think about, how are we going to move forward together? What is important? How do we continue to create that empathy and that understanding? I feel like I'm rambling and not answering your question.
I thought that was really good. I think that art is a really great way to bring people into those conversations, and because it does force you to see something from a different perspective, from the artist's perspective, and it invites a conversation. It's like, or if you don't understand it, or if you feel uncomfortable, because of what the art might be very directly saying, like, I remember Joseph Tisica's works on the pieces of astroturf that had very specific, like, phrases on it, like land back, or, decolonization, whatever, like many of those that would make you sort of stop and think, oh, what is this saying to me? How am I reacting to it? Why am I reacting this way? And then, what is the artist trying to say? So I think art is a way of getting into these conversations. I think that part of decolonization at an institution like a large art gallery, as you say, it involves bringing more Indigenous people into decision-making positions. But in the gallery context also means bringing more Indigenous art into the galleries, because that is the way that you open up those conversations and see things from different perspectives.
Yeah, and I think not just bringing them in, but creating a space and not dictating, who should be in those spaces. It's you go to community to listen who they want to be upholding them, who do you want to be represented by. So that collaboration and that openness is necessary. It's hard because we're trained not to do that, but it's critical, and we're going to make tons of mistakes for sure. But we do know, I don't know what the end goal is or what that looks like, but we do know there's definitely things that we can do to change and put us on the right path in ways that isn't necessarily ostracizing anybody or just getting people's backs up. Like that's not the goal. It really is to be a conversation. It's not meant to point fingers. And yeah, the thing in talking with the teams and colleagues, it's this fear right now is really feeding, like, this fear of change, which change is hard for everybody, but it's the only constant in the world and universe. But trying not to be driven by that fear of change. And what does that mean? And often the fear is driven by this sense of loss. Like, it means you're going to lose something, or even like take back, right? Which there's reasons why we're using some of this language. I don't know where I was going with that train of thought.
Well,
it was brilliant, though.
And that some of that language scares people, I guess,
It scares people, but it's not about taking away. It's actually benefits everybody. It benefits communication. It benefits our future generations. Like, that's why most of us are in the arts doing what we're doing, is really thinking ahead for many generations. Not in it for the money. Like,
right. Yeah, few people are artists for the money, for sure.
In hearing you share, it's making me think about, like, that question of decolonization, and in some of our conversations too, just that what I'm hearing from what you're saying is just, how do we make as many people feel as safe as possible?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then, like, when you look in a room, like, who are the people that we don't see here? And what could each of us be doing to make sure that those people are here?
Yeah.
And those are things that I think about in my practice, but in all spaces. And I think as people working in the arts, like those boundaries are so challenging of having like a professional or a private space. They're not, I mean, and then as Indigenous, or like I don't want to say as Indigenous folks, because I cannot and will not speak for everybody, but for myself, it's just that like community advocacy and just we can't like pull our hearts away from doing that other work too. And I often have like I'm traveling to LA next week to do a sound performance, and I wanted to bring Youth from Old Crow with me, but that wasn't able to be supported for whatever reasons. But we were able to do some sound and noise workshops with kids in Old Crow. Like this one 4-year-old made, oh my, like just blew my mind, really. Like, and just to be able to nurture voice and confidence in self, and especially with working in sound or in noise, they're things that are not normative. They're not normative ways that we're used to hearing or encountering in the world now. Like, and especially for, you're taught that maybe you're not supposed to be grunting or screaming or whatever, or like banging things around just to see what kind of sound they make. But to create a space that welcomes that and is specifically for that has been like, that is so freeing. I love seeing that. And to me, that's, I mean, when I was doing my master's and working in academic spaces, I'm like, oh, look at this decolonialist thesis that's happening. But I'm like, it's so many different things than that. And I think it can just be, I think that sound can be really empowering for all of us, but especially just nurturing that in young people. And especially I'm thinking about Kylie Bruce, like just that little 4-year-old jamming out. She stayed for 2 hours and like made noise music with me. And just was so into it, right? And that's what, yeah, I really love working in sound because of that. And it just pushes, and it can also be really abrasive too. And I really enjoy that kind of push and pull. And it just feels, I think, so familiar. Maybe that's the easiest way of being able to articulate some of those things that feel inarticulatable, as just through working with sound and noise.
I was interested in something you said, Michelle, about the normal way you curate like a curator is taught to curate a show is different from like what you've been thinking of, which is you go into the community and you ask the people, how do you want your art represented, or what do you think should be in the show? So I think that's a really interesting perspective in terms of like a less colonial way of looking at how you curate a show. Like, who do you involve in it? Who makes the decisions? What are the, Nate, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, I guess, yeah, like I think, now when I was never trained as a curator, I kind of fell into it, and I'm happy that I did. But now there's programs, you can train to be a curator. And I think because of the Western perspective, it really was about becoming that authoritative voice and dictating, what is art and what you should think about it. And, some people, maybe they still practice that way, and I'm not intentionally trying to judge that, but obviously I think I do. But for me, it's always been about decentering that. Like, I'm not an authority. Like, yes, I there's a bunch of stuff in my head, and I'm happy people like to hear about it sometimes, but we're continuously learning, right? And so being open to hearing, like, the people who are making the art, how do you want to be represented? Like, it's like, that's to me is just a common sense thing of how you work with an artist, how you work with a community. And I've had the privilege of working very collaboratively with artists and institutions, especially around the building of collections, and the collection that's stewarded at, formerly known as INAC. That was built over 50 years. It's 75 years of contemporary Indigenous art making, and it was built collaboratively with community. So it was never one director or one curator deciding what was going to enter that collection. It was not the senior levels of government or bureaucrats deciding what was going in that collection. It was always Indigenous artists from community who were saying this needs to be, this is important, this you need to look at. So really moving away from that model of institutions dictating what is art and what should be appreciated and valued. So opening up those spaces for those types of conversations, which also doesn't mean lowering the bar. It's not about that. It's just recognizing the different forms of expressions that come from different communities, the different mediums, and not just in the Indigenous art world, but that kind of black and white division that existed for a while and probably lingers a bit still today, but that idea of craft and fine art. And that's a very patriarchal, colonial way of holding down certain practices, and because it's rooted in language and learning and intergenerational communication, and that's what carries through this art, right? Again, I feel like I'm going off topic again.
No, that was great. But I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and just ask Jeneen a question, because we heard in the previous panel Sarah talking about getting this Michael purchasing this great artwork of yours, which is now off on loan and touring somewhere. Oh, it's back. But anyways, Jeneen, you are probably the Yukon's best known artist nationally and internationally. And I just want to ask, how did this happen? How did you get connected to the larger art world, and do you have any advice for artists in small northern communities like the Yukon? How do they find their place in the larger arts ecosystem? And, are there steps or things that happened along the way?
Anyway, so I had this garment, and the piece was that I was supposed to play this violin bow until the garment fell off my body, and then I would put the female caribou antler violin down. Also, the female caribou are the only female in the deer species that grow antlers, because that's how tough they have to be.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, Vuntut, that's like a story for another day about how the Gwitchin and the Vuntut are like family, basically. So I remember sitting there at the museum and waiting for my turn to go up, and my heart, I could see it beating through my clothes, and my hands started cramping. Like they all feeling went out of them, and they just turned into these little balls. And it was like, it's taken a lot to be able to stand up in a room and be like, I'm going to share these things. I need to, or just feeling comfortable taking up space in certain ways. And part of it is also just seeing my mom, my little mom Louise, getting upset, like someone not treating her well or being fair, and her just really sticking up for herself or sticking up for us. And, I grew up, I was raised for I think like 8 years of my life in PEI with my lesbian moms, and I'm, mixed Indigenous, seasonally white passing person. And, and then when you're in PEI where people grow up in their father's house, there was some stuff. And I just remember seeing my mom be like, absolutely not. And that, so I think, finding voice is, I think, an important tool and is big healing in medicine, no matter what path you're in. And in terms of that question of how did it happen? I'm like, I've been trying to think about that I have to thank Tara Hogue for giving me my first solo exhibition at that little gallery space in the downtown east side, GAM Gallery. Yeah. So that was my first solo show, and it meant so much to me, and it was so exciting to be part of Vancouver's Swarm back when they still had Swarm every September. And I took a long time to get through university. I took 6 years. So if it takes you time, that is just fine, right? And just keep trying at it. And I also want to thank Rita Wong for giving me, for having me as her intern for her Downstream Reimagining Water project. That opened so many doors for me. And then while I was working with her, I applied to do a residency, a work-learn position at the Banff Center. And I also want to thank Lauren Wood, who's a incredible artist, Métis, and like friend of mine, or I should say she's Métis. I just realized I called her an incredible Métis, and she is. But yeah, and she was the one who's like, "Hey, I got this job at the BAM Center. Like, you should come." Right? So it's just those. It's really just building up sets of relationships, and that's. Yeah, that's what I'll say for now. But I could awkwardly talk about it for a lot longer. I don't know.
I'm just going to ask one follow-up question, because I think one of the things that also really helped was you did get a gallerist representing you, and maybe talk about how that happened and what that has done for you.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, wow. I got to work with Letitia Fazakis, and I got to work with Sarah McCauley. And I want to thank Bo Dick, the late Chief Wallacequoyan Bo Dick, for connecting me with Letitia and with Sarah. Like, he took my work to both of them and was like, you should show this person. Right. And I remember going to an opening of, I think, Bo Dick, Nicholas Galanin, and Lawrence Polyexway-Lupton at Sarah's Space, Macaulay & Co. on East 2nd in Vancouver, and then like playing guitar in the parking lot with Bo and like singing. And I did the same thing. I was like, I'm going to sing a song. And I sang Nat King Cole's Nature Boy. And he played slide guitar, and we just had we had a really nice friendship, and he was very supportive, and he was the artist in residence when I was doing my master's at the University of British Columbia. Dana Claxton was my wow, I'm forgetting institutional language already, which is like yes, but also yeah, she was the my main supervisor on my master's, and just having her, and then working with Olivia Wheatung, who's in the same program as me, and then Bo as an artist in residence, just made it possible to survive there, because I wanted to leave it like several times, because institutions are hard places. And yeah, it was just really incredible to get to work with them, and then be reading dense theory, and I can't even remember who it was. It was like, I don't know, probably Immanuel Kant or something like that. And then going to Bo's studio and talking with him about it. And it was just so refreshing for him to say, like, there's this colonization ship, and then there's like the language around it, and the like the decolonizing, and the like all the things that arrived on that ship, the colonizing, the taking, the everything. But he's like, that ship's over here, and like we have our own basket. Right, and that's what came from talking about, like the critique of judgment or whatever with Bo. That's what I remember more out of it. So, I think I did a little ramble.
No,
I don't know.
that was great. And actually, I mean, the importance of relationships, and also having other artists champion your work and take that and say, like, go to a gallerist and say, you should show this person's work.
Yeah.
That's sort of how you got your foot in the door.
Yeah, and I just want to say, working with Sarah has been incredible. Like, she's been such an amazing advocate for me and my work. And she came up to Old Crow. We with Vanessa Kwan, and we roasted a caribou shoulder and then ate it. And then I'm going to be turning that into a sound tool for the thing in LA. And next week. And yeah, Sarah's just in getting to know other artists' stories, working with commercial galleries. I'm like, oh, this is not the norm. Yeah, she's really, really incredible. And we're talking about I'm like, I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about it. But yeah, we're cooking up some things.
Okay, so connecting to a really good gallerist was definitely a big part of your success. I mean, in terms of moving forward and selling work, and like selling work internationally, and being invited to like art fairs around the world, things like that, that happened through a gallery.
Yeah. And I really want to thank, I remember Nikki Little talked about acknowledging on her CV different Indigenous mentors that she had before placing what university she went to. And I think that's really important. Like, I want to, all my aunties and like people who came to support. So maybe my aunties flew down to Vancouver when I graduated. Like, that was just so special, right? And I'm grateful to have had that support. And I also really want to thank Dana Claxton for her continued mentorship and friendship. And it's just, been really amazing to learn from her work, and also I just like unabashedly am such a fangirl. It's like I don't care if this looks awkward. I'm like, I'm gonna quote you when you're in the room. Like yeah.
So that's interesting to hear sort of your journey, which is very much based on relationships with people who've helped you along the way.
There's so many more. I'm so sorry.
It's okay, but you also, we did have a discussion about what is success as an artist, because you've achieved a certain amount of like commercial success and you're collected in, you know, galleries and private collections, but success has different meanings at different stages of one's life and one's journey as an artist. So, you know, it's not the same for everyone.
Mm-hmm. How would, I mean, you talked about being at the mothership institution, right? Like, how does that land with you?
Probably oddly, but well, success, there's different ways to measure success, and there's ways that it's traditionally been measured, which is exclusive. So, I think success is really about, finding that voice and accepting that it's going to take work, hard work. And I know we were talking to yesterday, even this idea of applying for things. A lot of the art world is rejection and not getting things right away, but you keep doing it, right? And you take the advice of people, your peers, your mentors. Really take that to heart. And if you are upheld by your community and you're supporting your community, to me that's success. It's not so much a particular person in a particular position with a particular title saying, "Oh, you're good." It's like, whatever. Like, that's your opinion, right? But if you have your community or your family who are usually non-artists, in my case, took like, I think I was like 36 years old when my dad was like, "So this is like a job." He's like you can make money doing this. I'm like, "Yes, Dad." So it's this idea of getting acknowledgement from places that you think it should come automatically, but it doesn't necessarily. But of course, also just the ability to share your work, regardless of how large or small the venue is success. I think we often put privilege on the center, the big centers, I guess, who've told us they're the center of the art world. But to get your work out in communities in various ways, for those of us who are in institutions building collections, how can we get that work out there to advocate for artists? I think that's success, right? Is your reach as well, like who you're communicating to and the impact that has, the inspiration that you can give to others by making and by sharing people's stories. And I don't know.
No, I love
There's
that.
tons of other things.
But those are important things, like the sharing your work and inspiring others.
I wonder, what feels like a successful show to you, or a successful moment, or like, has there been an opening where you're like, yes, this is it?
Yeah, like lots of shows, like mostly like things when I saw, for example, our amazing colleague Tanya Willard and that Beat Nation show, really starting kind of from a grassroots community-led, bringing in voices who were not necessarily being focused on or kind of excluded from a kind of fine arts kind of way, and just seeing it blow up and become one of the best exhibitions ever. So I like seeing things like that. Of course, in terms of like the National Gallery's history, to see solo shows by Indigenous artists is pretty amazing. It took too long, but kudos for my former colleague to being able to do that within that institution. Major group exhibitions that have been happening, even if you go back to, we know there's the Land Spirit Power and Indigena are often kind of cited as like pivotal. It was a pivotal moment, pivotal time, but the impact those types of exhibitions have you know, these delegations, the fact that there's funding in Canada, what we now call Canada, for artists to travel, to interact with peers, like take advantage of that's incredible, right? I think that success, having that privilege and that opportunity to connect with other makers and to hold each other up as well. I think what you were saying, it's, you know, one of the reasons I left Toronto earlier in my career was it was too competitive, and I found it annoying because if you have to think bigger picture, and it's like if we're constantly trying to like step over each other, that's not going to help any of us in the long run. And so don't be afraid to support your peer. It's not a competition. There's enough space, right? There's enough space for us all to share our making with the world.
That's great. I love that. Well, that's actually, I think what, you know, the earlier panel was sort of saying, like, what's the secret to why there's so much creativity in the Yukon? And I think one of the elements is the very supportive community where artists do share with each other and, you know, do help each other out. I think that's a wonderful thing about this community. Speaking of sharing, I want to share some of our time. We started late, but I think lunch is scheduled to start in 15 minutes, so we do have a bit of time for questions. Are there any questions from those of you here in the audience?
Very struck by, you know, hearing you talk about success, because I think one of the great things about being able to assume a position of some influence is that you have more opportunity to give. Whereas the traditional, you know, patriarchal European concept is that to rise to the top of an organization is to sort of somehow to take, to claim, and whereas the gratification of success is actually to have a bigger capacity to give, support other artists, support thought, you know, support people whose talents are emerging, support people whose contributions have been overlooked and forgotten, but it's being in a position to give.
Yeah. Well, and
That's
I see it as like I'm in my positions. I'm very lucky. I've had a great career so far. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but you know, you go with the flow and it's good. But I see it as a facilitator. Like I'm in these positions to facilitate opportunities for artists, and that's a big responsibility. But I think that's part of our kind of, you know, Indigenous ways of thinking too, and this idea of, and you know, maybe not all, I don't know everybody's cultural practices, but that idea of a chief who's, you know, it's not a pyramid top down, right? The chief, the people in power are there to uplift the others, and that kind of flattening of hierarchies to create a equality. You know, you know, you don't have to be authoritative to be in a position of authority. Yeah, but what do I know?
Lots, we love it. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have
Oh, sorry. Oh,
I can ask you later.
okay. There was a hand up over here. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to address my question to Michelle. Got the name correct?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very interested in Indigenous art and have collected a little bit in the last 50 years since I've lived in Canada, when funds allowed. And I noticed just recently, I've seen a lot of Indigenous art coming out of the West Coast most of the time, from my perspective, what I've seen anyway. And some of it is absolutely stunning, just really, really interesting, thoughtful work. But what occurred to me was, in the old days, my understanding was that to use the designs and to use the patterns, to use the shapes, so on and so forth, was really quite carefully controlled. There were, shall we call them, gatekeepers within a community who would give the nod if you were allowed to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm just wondering if there's any difficulties faced by these contemporary Indigenous artists, because they are definitely, from what I understand, breaking the rules of traditional Indigenous art.
Yeah, well, I think it depends on how you look at that, because for me, the idea of tradition is is fraught. It's often seen as something in the past and stagnant and static. But Indigenous traditions in particular is always about adapting and change and pushing boundaries, listening to not just your community, but your heart and what you need to do as an artist to speak, and share that information. So I do think, it may appear that maybe rules will be broken, and really, like, that's the privilege every artist has, is, you break the rules, take some people off. If people aren't getting upset or noticing, then you're probably not doing something right. Like, you gotta stir the pot a little bit. But yeah, for me, it's not breaking rules. It's carrying on traditions, and there's just different ways to visualize that, and it's pushing the practice beyond, and probably also a little bit of also recognizing the plurality within us, as Indigenous peoples. You're carrying all this different types of knowledge, not just from community, but we're all colonized, we're all educated in a Western way. And where do those overlap? And that's okay to kind of embrace that, and to have other, many of us are mixed as well. I'm mixed as well. How does that inform what I do? I don't know if I'm really answering your question,
No,
but
it's interesting to hear your perspective. Thank you very much indeed.
and I mean, you're the artist, so how do you feel about that? And when you're using cultural knowledge to create work, right? Like, there is a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes, I think, from artists, that it's not meant to be a show, but we do have our ways to consult, right? And we'll get bannock slapped if we do something wrong.
Yeah. I have ways that I would answer, maybe if, like, just you and I were having tea, right? I want to be careful, and I also want to be respectful, and I also want to refuse. And I'm not able to find. I don't know if I'm finding. I don't know if I can find words other than that at this moment. But that. Yeah.
I really want to, can I jump in for a
Yes.
moment?
Yeah.
I would just say also that, I think we need to think about the word gatekeeping, and I know that we're thinking about, like, how does it seem in this moment for older artists who are saying only certain things have to be done in a particular way, but I think we need to keep in mind that it's actually, it's a protection, because the Canadian government made it illegal to practice Indigenous culture, particularly on the Northwest Coast. There was a potlatch ban, things were stolen, removed from communities, burned. And so when you have this older generation that feels very, very protective over a very specific way of wanting to maintain those visual forms that are connected to stories and song and dance and performance, it's because it was almost taken away. And so I can see how for younger artists it may feel sometimes like there are a lot of protocols that inform, like, what can and cannot be done, but I think that we're seeing so much cultural fluorescence right now because we are not in that position anymore where we are on the precipice of having something stolen from us, and we are starting to reclaim those traditions. So, like, as an Inuk, there was a period of just a couple of months where there were no elders in the north who had traditional tattoos. And there was a filmmaker, Alethea Arnapok-Barrel, she was traveling through the Arctic and interviewing the last people to have them, because the church had banned the traditional tattoo practice, that it was paganistic and it's satanistic, and didn't want Inuit doing any of their previous cultural practices. And so there was a very short period where the last elder died before she could finish the filming, and then she went and got her facial tattoos, and now it's like I almost know more Inuit that have tattoos than don't. And that's in a period of like 2005 to now. And so I think that we are seeing a big explosion of innovation within tradition, because we're not going back to that place. And I think it's very exciting.
Thank you, Leah. That's a
Thank you, Heather.
My concern was about
I got
Thank you.
such interesting work that I'd like to see more of. And I'm just wondering if within their own communities they were having any issue, shall we say.
Well, I think
That's a
that
good question.
Yeah.
it can feel very, very important because it was definitely a life or death kind of a
It makes
situation,
sense,
but.
what you've said makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, but now we get to have it all, you know, we get to
Mhm.
really
Yeah.
understand it because they kept it secret and they kept it safe and they potlatched in secret and they kept that going, now we have all that to go back to and to draw from, and it's really useful.
Thank you.
I think
So,
there was a
I
question.
think we just have time for one more question, just because I want to give people time for lunch, so.
It's okay, I've already had a question, so.
No, but is there anyone else? Oh, okay, Michelle, oh, sorry, yeah,
I
Michelle.
just wanted to connect to this conversation to the question that I was originally going to ask. Because having worked at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria for so many years, we did work with a lot of artists who came out of West Coast Indigenous communities and were working with those visual languages one-on-one. And in my conversations, what I saw were people who had learned through mentorship, and once they had achieved the language and they knew the rules, they were allowed to break the rules. So the way that relates to my question is I was really struck by the way you described acquiring work at INAC. Is that the proper?
No,
Cernak.
Cernak,
Former,
yeah.
former proper.
Yeah, Cernak.
Formerly known as.
Sorry. And doing that through community and, having a continuum from craft to fine art and breaking that down. And I was wondering if through that process, you ever found that any approach to making art got left out. I think about what would happen if a mainstream non-Indigenous institution asked the community what to collect. I never asked in Victoria, but I was told all of the time, more Emily Carr. So I was just wondering, like, whether there's that tension, or whether there is like an openness to all forms of art through that process.
I think there is, but that's also comes down to like when you're assembling a group of people to make those decisions. It's a big job to bring together a jury and ensure diversity within an Indigenous context. You know, of course you have the overarching First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, but within that, so many. It's big country, right? And how do you get those diverse voices in, and not just culturally, but medium expertise as well. So people who are familiar with different ways of making materials, customary or contemporary, and a range of like emerging to established voices as well. So, and you just kind of rotate that out. And so I think through that, the collection at Cernak is probably one of the most important collections in the world of contemporary Indigenous art. There is holes, there's always holes, in part because that collection, you have to, like an open call goes out publicly and artists have to submit and then it's juried. And often there's like, oh, you don't have any art from, here. And it's like, well, they didn't apply. So you can't force people to apply. So I'd say apply to everything. So like apply to everything. But in that, also because of even the idea of care of artwork and conservation kind of impacts sometimes what you can bring into a collection. So it's quite different, like the rules of mainstream institutions, what you can bring into the collection versus a community collection like that, the diversity in materials. But like new media art was a big hole, and I think that's partly because it was kind of it was seen as maybe a break from traditions or something, but that was before, a lot of people were, it's directly connected to it, right? It's another form of storytelling. It's another form of expressing yourself, like the work that you're doing as well, like how people are reading that and comparing it. It's tied to customary practices and community and language. But it's you're doing that through a different form. But then collections have to come to terms with how do you exhibit that? How do you care for it long term? But yeah, that was a hole for a while. So we opened the call up to include new media artists. Then you can focus in on areas where there's holes in collections as well.
I
feel
just
like I'm not answering your
I
question.
wanted to just make one comment about different approaches to conservation, which, because that's also an issue in terms of a colonial approach to conservation. And so, and this is kind of relevant because there's going to be a performance tonight at the gala, and Anne Smith, who is an artist, an elder, and dancer, is going to be dancing a traditional robe that she wove. So, and this robe was on display actually in the art crawl yesterday, and it is in the collection of Cernak's collection. So it is on loan back to us so that it can be danced, recognizing that that is part of, like, giving it life, allowing it to live, is having it come back into its home community and to be used for the purpose that it was created, not just like back in some vault or even just in display somewhere. So those are just different ways of thinking about different approaches to collecting and conserving art. And I just love that that is actually going to be part of the show tonight, is something that was collected by a public institution, but is allowed to live in the way that it was intended to live. And that is, in a way, a bit of a decolonial approach to art.
Oh, huge! It's a big issue for institutions to have work go out in the world and unprotected, without couriers and white gloves. But I think that's part of it too. It's not about ownership; it's about stewardship too, right? And you have these stewardship agreements with artists, like, how do you want to see your work activated? And allowing that space for artists to have a say in what happens to the work and how it should be cared for long term, or
Well, thank you very, very much. This has been a really interesting discussion.